The bone pushed through my forearm at an angle that should have ended my candidacy. Compound fracture, the apothecary called it later, though at the moment I was too busy watching my own flesh move to care about terminology. The skin crawled, not metaphorically, not poetically, but actually crawled, sliding across exposed muscle like something alive and separate from me. I watched the jagged edge of my ulna retreat back into my arm, watched tissue seal over it in wet layers, and I did not scream because I had stopped screaming during the third trial, back when I still believed failure meant release. Marcus Vance, that was my name before they brought me to this mountain, before the gene seed, before the operations that worked precisely enough to keep me useful but never enough to make me whole. I hold on to that name now, the way a drowning man holds on to driftwood, knowing it will not save him, knowing the current will take him anyway, but unwilling to let go because letting go means admitting the water has already won. The training hall smelled of blood and sacred oils, a mixture I had come to associate with my own repeated deaths. 17 times I had failed the trial of endurance. 17 times my heart had stopped, my brain had starved, my body had crossed whatever threshold separates the living from the dead. 17 times I had returned. The other neophytes watched me now with something between fascination and horror, the way soldiers watch a wounded animal that refuses to stop moving. Brother Sergeant Castus stood at the edge of the sparring circle, his scarred face unreadable, data slate in hand recording metrics I was never permitted to see. My arm finished healing with a sound like wet cloth tearing in reverse. The sensation was worse than the break itself, a deep wrongness that radiated from bone to fingertip. I flexed my fingers. They worked. They always worked. Again, Castus said. The servitor combat drone activated across from me, its augmetic limbs clicking into attack configuration. These were not training machines in any meaningful sense. They were designed to kill, programmed with the combat patterns of orc war bosses and chaos champions, their strength settings calibrated to exceed human tolerance. I had seen other aspirants torn apart by them. Those aspirants had the mercy of staying dead. I raised my training blade and waited for the pain that was coming. The first blow shattered my left knee. The second crushed 3 ribs and punctured a lung. By the third strike I was on the ground, blood filling my mouth, and the servitor's bladed appendage had opened my stomach to the cold air of the training hall. I felt my intestines shift, felt them sliding toward the wound, felt the bizarre suction of exposed viscera trying to exit a body that was already working to pull them back. Above me, through blood-filmed eyes, I saw Castus making notes. Healing began before the servitor had finished its kill sequence. The machine's bladed limb descended toward my throat, but my stomach was already sealing, the intestinal tissue finding its way back to proper configuration through some process I did not understand and could not control. The blade struck my neck at the precise moment my knee reformed, and I screamed because the healing hurt more than the wounds ever did. The apothecary called it hypercellular regeneration. The chaplain called it a blessing of the god emperor. The other neophytes called me nothing at all because they had stopped speaking to me after the 7th trial when they realized that my continued presence was not persistence, but something else entirely. I did not know what to call it. I only knew that every night when they locked me in the cell with the other failures, I pressed my fingers to the stone walls and felt the scratches left by previous occupants. Names, dates, tally marks counting trials survived. The scratches went deep into the rock, some of them old enough that centuries of moisture had smoothed their edges, and I had begun to recognize patterns in them. The same names appearing again and again, the count marks growing higher and higher until they simply stopped. Where did those names go? Where did those men end up, the ones who could not die but could not transform, the ones who scratched their identities into stone because they feared forgetting themselves? I asked Brother Sergeant Castus once. He had looked at me with something that might have been pity if he were still capable of such an emotion, and he had said, "They served, nothing more. They served." The trial of blood was scheduled for the following morning, and I spent the night cataloging my injuries the way other aspirants catalogued their hopes. The lung had healed but felt wrong, the tissue denser than before. My knee clicked when I walked, not painfully but audibly, a grinding of cartilage that had regrown in imperfect alignment. The stomach wound had left a scar despite regeneration, a pale ridge of tissue that pulsed faintly when I pressed against it, as if something beneath the surface was still moving. 3 years. I had been in training for 3 years. The standard progression from aspirant to scout took 5 years for those who survived. I was surviving, but I was not progressing. The gene seed had taken in my body but had not advanced, suspended in some intermediate state that the apothecaries could not explain and the chaplains called a test of faith. Each trial was supposed to trigger the next phase of transformation. Each trial failed to do so, and yet I could not die. I had tried. Not with conviction, not with proper intent, but I had allowed wounds to deepen, had failed to dodge killing blows I might have avoided. Each time my body had healed itself with that terrible crawling sensation, pulling me back from whatever threshold I had crossed. The apothecaries had noticed. They had begun restraining me during recovery periods, not for my safety but to prevent what they called interference with the Emperor's design. Their examination chambers were cold, and they spoke about me in the third person even when I was conscious. Subject Vance, Candidate 12 Sigma, the persistent anomaly. I had stopped correcting them. The trial of blood took place in the lower vaults, where the chapter kept its oldest secrets and its most dangerous training mechanisms. I descended with 9 other aspirants, all of them further along the transformation than I was, their bodies already showing the characteristic bulk and density of developing transhuman physiology. I looked like a child among them, still baseline human in form if not in function, my regenerative curse hidden beneath unremarkable flesh. The vault smelled of copper and machine lubricant and something older, something sweet and rotten that I could not identify. The walls were marked with kill tallies going back centuries, the names of aspirants who had completed this trial inscribed in honor rolls that stretched toward the vaulted ceiling. I looked for the names from my cell, the scratched identities of the failures who could not die. None of them appeared on the honor rolls. They served, Castus had said, but not as battle brothers, not as anything this place acknowledged. The trial itself was simple in concept. We would face live combat against captured enemies, heretics and xenos, held in stasis for this purpose. We would kill or be killed. Those who survived and demonstrated sufficient aggression would trigger the next phase of their transformation. Those who died would receive the Emperor's peace. Those who survived but did not transform would face the trial again, and again, and again. I had faced this trial 11 times before. The first enemy they released was a human, a cultist of some dark faith whose symbols had been burned away but whose madness remained intact. He came at me with a crude blade and the strength of fanatic conviction, and I let him open my throat because I wanted to see if this time would be different. It was not different. The blood fountained and then slowed and then stopped, the tissue rebuilding itself while the cultist stared in horror at what he had done and what it had failed to accomplish. I killed him while he was still staring, not out of mercy but out of irritation, and his blood joined the centuries of accumulated residue on the vault floor. 3 more opponents, 3 more deaths that should have been mine. The other aspirants completed their combats with the expected brutality, their developing transhuman physiology allowing them to shrug off wounds that would have crippled baseline humans. I watched them grow stronger as they fought, watched their bodies respond to stress with accelerated development, watched them become something more while I remained stubbornly, impossibly the same. The final opponent was an orc, juvenile but still massive compared to any human. They released it from stasis with ceremonial prayers and stepped back to watch the carnage. The greenskin targeted me. Some instinct perhaps, some recognition of the weak member of the herd. It crossed the vault floor in 3 massive strides and brought its crude cleaver down with enough force to split me from crown to groin. I did not dodge. I was tired of dodging. The cleaver struck my shoulder and continued through my chest cavity, through my stomach, through my pelvis, and out through my left hip. My body separated into 2 pieces that should have been incompatible with any form of life. I felt my heart stop, both the original and the secondary that had been implanted years ago. I felt my consciousness begin to dissolve into the comfortable darkness that I had been chasing for so long. and then the pieces began to move toward each other. The apothecaries said later that full regeneration from bifurcation took 17 minutes. They said it with the clinical detachment of men documenting a specimen rather than treating a patient. They said it while the other aspirants stood at the edge of the medical bay, their combat-enhanced eyes fixed on my reassembling body with an expression I had come to recognize as the first stage of fear. 17 minutes, long enough for the orc to be killed by other aspirants, long enough for the trial to be declared complete, long enough for my organs to find each other across the blood-slicked floor and begin the slow process of reintegration. I was conscious for all of it. The gene seed in my chest had kept enough brain function active to ensure I experienced every moment of my body crawling back together, vertebrae clicking into alignment one by one, nerve tissue splicing itself with a pain that existed outside normal human reference points. When it was over, I sat up on the medical slab and vomited blood and bile and something solid that the apothecaries collected in a specimen jar before I could see what it was. Candidate 12 Sigma, one of them said, consulting a data slate. Trial of blood, 12th iteration. Result, survival without advancement. Recommend continued observation and escalated trial protocols. Escalated protocols. I would learn what that meant soon enough. They moved me to a different cell that night, separated from the other failure candidates, placed in a section of the fortress monastery I had never seen before. The walls here were thicker, the doors reinforced, the monitoring systems more elaborate, and the scratches on the stone were deeper, more numerous, more desperate. Hundreds of names, thousands of tally marks, dates going back centuries, carved with fingernails and bone shards and what looked like teeth. Some of the names repeated across multiple walls, their tallies growing to absurd numbers. 100 trials, 200, 500. The marks continued past counting, becoming abstract patterns that I first mistook for decoration before recognizing them as the final expressions of minds that had given up on numerical thought entirely. One name appeared more than any other. Voss. The tallies beside it covered an entire wall, overlapping and intersecting until they formed a solid mass of carved stone. I pressed my fingers into the grooves and felt how deep they went. Whoever Voss was, he had been here for a very long time, and he had stopped counting but had not stopped scratching. "You noticed," a voice said from the darkness of the cell's corner. I did not startle. The gene seed had suppressed my startle reflex during the first weeks of implantation, and 3 years of constant trauma had eliminated any residual tendency towards surprise. I turned toward the voice and saw a figure sitting in the shadows, humanoid in general shape but wrong in proportions, the limbs too long, the torso too dense, the head misshapen in ways the darkness prevented me from fully perceiving. "Voss?" I asked, a sound that might have been laughter, if laughter could be translated through vocal cords that had not been designed for it. Not anymore. Not for a long time. But yes, I made those marks. I made all the marks. Every name you see, I carved it after the candidate who bore it was taken. Taken where? Where we all go eventually. The figure shifted, and I caught a glimpse of something that no longer resembled a human face. Where you will go when they have finished learning what you can teach them. The chapter does not waste resources, even failed resources, especially failed resources. I should have been afraid. Any reasonable being would have been afraid. But I had died too many times for fear to find purchase, and the wrongness of this creature felt less alien than the wrongness of my own healing flesh. "What are you?" I asked. "What you are becoming, what they are making you into. The transformation works, you see. It just doesn't work the way the Codex intended. For some of us, the gene seed finds a different path." The figure moved into the dim light that filtered through the cell's single ventilation shaft, and I saw what centuries of failed trials had produced. The body had ceased to be human in any meaningful sense. Muscle and bone had continued growing without the guidance of proper transhuman development, creating a form that was massive but chaotic, asymmetric, powerful but purposeless. The face was a confusion of features, some recognizable as once human, others grown from tissue that had never been designed to form facial structures. The eyes, though, the eyes were lucid and ancient, and filled with a resignation so complete that it radiated from them like heat from a forge. "I have served this chapter for 800 years," creature that was once Voss said. "Not as a battle brother, not as anything the honor rolls would acknowledge, but I have served, I have bled, I have died more times than the marks on these walls can count, and I have been used. Used for what? Research, combat testing, biological extraction. There are compounds in our blood, enzymes in our tissue that the apothecaries cannot replicate through other means. The failed candidates who do not die become a resource, maintained until we are depleted, broken down for parts when our usefulness expires. The chapter has an exceptional success rate in creating new battle brothers. Did you know that? Higher than almost any other chapter in the Imperium. I had not known. The chapter's propaganda had always emphasized the rigor of their trials, the purity of their selection, the divine favor that guided their process. They had never mentioned efficiency rates. "They use our tissue," Voss continued. "Something in the failed transformation produces catalysts that help the successful ones. We die so that others can live. We suffer so that others can be spared suffering. This is the purpose they found for us when they realized we could not fulfill the purpose we were chosen for. The revelation should have been devastating. Instead, it felt like the final piece of a puzzle I had been assembling without knowing I was solving it. The examinations, the tissue samples, the way the apothecaries looked at me not as a patient but as a crop to be harvested. How long, I asked. How long before they start using me? They already have. Every time you heal, they collect what your body produces. Every time you die in return, they study the mechanisms. You have been serving since your first trial. You simply did not know it." I looked at my hands, at the flesh that would not stop rebuilding itself, and I understood finally what that flesh was for, not for my survival, not for my eventual transformation, but for the transformation of others, for the extraction of compounds that my failure could produce and my success never would. I was a resource. I had always been a resource. The training intensified after that, or perhaps it was not training at all, merely the infliction of damage that my body could repair and the apothecaries could study. Brother Sergeant Castus no longer observed my trials with detached professionalism. Now he supervised the systematic destruction of my body with the focused attention of a man conducting important work. They cut me. They burned me. They exposed me to toxins and radiation and void conditions. They broke every bone and ruptured every organ and recorded the order and speed of my regeneration. The apothecaries developed new procedures based on their findings, techniques for accelerating gene seed integration in successful candidates. The chapter's success rate climbed even higher. I spoke with Voss during the recovery periods, in the cell we now shared. He told me the names on the walls, the stories of candidates who had preceded me, the various ends they had met when their usefulness expired. Some had been broken down completely, their tissue incorporated into the chapter's gene seed reserves. Some had been sent to fight in the most hopeless campaigns, their unkillable bodies used to absorb enemy fire. Until even their regeneration failed. Some had simply been sealed in stasis and forgotten, their consciousness suspended in dreamless darkness until the chapter needed them for something. None of them had been released. None of them had been allowed to die cleanly. The Emperor's peace was a luxury afforded only to those who could fail in ordinary ways. I asked Voss why he was telling me these things, what purpose it served to inform me of a fate I could not escape. "Because you are different," he said. "The others all broke. Eventually their minds collapsed under the accumulation of trauma, and they became simple, easy to use, easy to discard. But you are still asking questions. You are still remembering your name. You are still something more than just a body that regenerates. Is that supposed to make me feel better? It is supposed to make you dangerous." I did not understand what he meant. Not then. The trials continued, and my body continued to rebuild itself, and the apothecaries continued to harvest what my failure produced. Months passed, years. My sense of time began to blur, marked only by the accumulation of scars that my regeneration could not quite erase, and the gradual deterioration of Voss's once massive form as the chapter extracted more and more from his depleted tissue. They came for him on a morning that smelled of sacred incense and machine oil. 4 battle brothers in full armor, accompanied by an apothecary carrying tools I recognized from my own examinations. Voss did not resist. He had known this was coming, had been expecting it for decades, and he went with the quiet dignity of a man who had made peace with an ending that would not be peaceful. "Remember," he said to me as they led him through the cell door, "remember everything I told you. Remember what you are and what they are making you into. And when you find your purpose, make sure it is your own." They sealed the door behind him. I heard his footsteps fade down the corridor toward the deeper vaults where the chapter kept its most permanent secrets. I heard nothing after that. No screams, no machinery, no prayers for the departed. Voss was gone, extracted, used until there was nothing left to use. I added his name to the wall that night, carving it with a fingernail that broke and regrew and broke again. The scratch was shallow compared to his centuries of marks, but it was something. An acknowledgement, a refusal to let him disappear entirely into the chapter's operational needs. And then I began to plan. The apothecaries had become careless with me. After years of compliance, years of passive acceptance of whatever they did to my body, they had stopped treating me as a potential threat. I was just a resource after all, just tissue that happened to be attached to a consciousness. The restraints during examinations were perfunctory now, the monitoring less attentive, the guards fewer and less alert. I started paying attention to the schedules, the routes, the security systems, the locations of things I might need if I wanted to do something other than serve as raw material for the chapter's success rate. I found the records first, stored in cogitator systems that the apothecaries accessed during my examinations, visible on their data slates when they thought I was unconscious. Centuries of data on candidates like me, on the compounds extracted from our tissue, on the procedures developed through our suffering. The chapter's great secret, documented in clinical detail, they did not simply train superior warriors, they manufactured them using the processed remains of those who could not transform. The current generation of successful battle brothers carried pieces of former failures in their blood. Every scout, every initiate, every veteran in the chapter's service owed some portion of their enhanced physiology to candidates who had been broken down and repurposed. They were walking monuments to consumed lives. The facility where the processing took place was in the deepest level of the fortress monastery, accessible only through security checkpoints that required specific genetic authorization. But the apothecaries traveled there regularly, and their genetic signatures were stored in the same cogitator systems I had learned to observe. Replicating one would be impossible for a normal human. I was not a normal human. I had not been normal for a very long time. The regeneration that plagued me also gave me access to my own cellular structure in ways the apothecaries had never anticipated. I could feel the gene seed in my chest, the suspended transformation that refused to complete, the constant cellular activity that kept me alive despite everything they did to destroy me. I learned to direct that activity, to guide the regeneration toward specific ends, rather than simply allowing it to restore whatever had been damaged. It took months, agonizing months of self-modification, of forcing my flesh to grow in patterns it was not designed for, of reshaping tissue at the molecular level through sheer force of will and the desperate hope that there was still something in me worth saving. The apothecaries noticed the changes in my blood work, the anomalies in my tissue samples, but they attributed them to the natural progression of my condition. Just another stage of failed transformation, they decided. Just another opportunity for research. They did not realize I was building something. The security checkpoint required genetic authorization from a specific apothecary, a man named Theron, who had overseen my examinations for the past 3 years. His genetic signature was stored in my cells, absorbed during the countless samples he had taken, integrated into my flesh, along with everything else my body had been exposed to. I had learned to isolate it, to express it, to wear it like a mask that the checkpoint sensors could not distinguish from the genuine article. I passed through the first checkpoint on a night when the fortress monastery was focused on a victory celebration in the upper halls. Some campaign had been won, some enemy destroyed, and the chapter was honoring its heroes with the appropriate ceremonies. The guards at the deep levels were minimal. their attention divided between duty and the festivities they were missing. The second checkpoint was harder. The sensors here were more sophisticated, designed to detect not just genetic identity but also transhuman physiological markers that I did not possess. But I had spent years observing the apothecary's procedures, understanding the mechanisms they used to bypass security, and I had learned that the markers could be simulated through specific hormonal cascades that my modified cells could produce on demand. I passed through smelling of stress chemicals and regenerative enzymes, my body flooding itself with compounds that should only have existed in successfully transformed battle brothers. The sensors registered my presence as anomalous but authorized, and the doors opened. The processing facility was exactly as Voss had described it. Surgical bays lined with bodies in various stages of disassembly, preservation tanks containing tissue and organs and compounds extracted from candidates who would never leave this room. Cogitator systems humming with data on every failure the chapter had ever claimed to have released to the Emperor's mercy, and in the center of it all, connected to machines that pumped and filtered and processed the bodies of the most recent extractions. I recognized some of them. Candidates from my cell, men I had watched die and recover and die again until they stopped recovering. Their faces were slack, their eyes open but vacant, their chests rising and falling with the mechanical rhythm of life support systems that kept their tissue viable for harvesting. Voss was there, still alive technically, still generating the compounds the chapter needed, still trapped in a body that would not grant him the release he had been seeking for 8 centuries. I found the control systems, the termination protocols, the commands that would shut down the life support and allow these men to finally stop serving. And I hesitated. Not because I doubted what needed to be done, not because I feared the consequences, but because I realized, standing in the midst of so much accumulated suffering, that simple termination was not enough. The chapter would continue. The practices would continue. New failures would be brought here, processed here, consumed here. Ending these lives would be mercy, but it would not be justice. I needed to do more. I needed to make sure this could never happen again. The cogitator systems contained more than just medical records. They contained the chapter's most sensitive information, deployment schedules, security protocols, communication codes, the locations of assets that the Imperium's oversight bodies did not know existed. They contained enough evidence to destroy the chapter's reputation, to bring inquisitorial attention to practices that even the most pragmatic authorities would find difficult to justify. I began to copy the data, carefully, methodically, using the techniques I had learned from observing the apothecary's own information security procedures. The files were vast, centuries of documented atrocity compressed into data packets that I stored in modified tissue I had grown specifically for this purpose. The alarm began to sound while I was still downloading. They had detected my intrusion finally. The genetic mask had held, but the data access had triggered secondary security systems that I had not anticipated. The doors to the processing facility sealed, and I heard the footsteps of armored warriors converging from multiple directions. I did not try to run. There was nowhere to run to, and my body would regenerate whatever they did to me anyway. Instead, I completed the download, sealed the data away in tissue that my regeneration would protect, and turned to face the battle brothers who came to stop me. There were 12 of them, full warriors in blessed armor, their weapons charged and their intent clear. I was a single failed candidate with no armor, no weapons, and no hope of defeating them through conventional means. But I had stopped caring about conventional means a long time ago. Candidate 12 Sigma, the sergeant leading them, said, "You will submit to restraint and await judgment for your intrusion. My name is Marcus Vance. Your designation is Candidate 12 Sigma. You have no other identity. You are a resource of this chapter, and you will be treated as such." I looked at him, at the armor he wore, at the enhanced physiology that moved beneath that armor, and I thought about all the candidates whose processed remains had contributed to his development, all the men who had died in these vaults, so that he could stand here and tell me I was nothing but raw material. "Your armor," I said, "the genetic enhancements that let you wear it, do you know where they come from? The Emperor's blessing and the chapter's sacred rites, they come from here. I gestured at the processing tanks, at the bodies still connected to extraction systems, at the evidence of centuries of consumption. They come from men like me who could not transform but could not die. Your blood contains pieces of them. Your tissue is built from their remains. You are not a space marine. You are a monument to murder. The sergeant did not respond. His brothers did not respond. They were space marines, transhuman warriors trained to suppress doubt and reject hesitation, and nothing I said could penetrate the conditioning that had shaped them. But the hesitation was there, a fraction of a second of uncertainty before they moved to restrain me, a flicker of something in their enhanced eyes that might have been the first stirring of questions they had never been permitted to ask. It was enough. I did not fight them. I did not resist the restraints or struggle against the hands that gripped my arms. Instead, I triggered the final modification I had built into my regenerating flesh, the one I had been preparing for months without fully understanding what I was preparing for. The data I had downloaded was stored in specialized tissue throughout my body. That tissue was designed to do more than just hold information. It was designed to broadcast. Every Vox system in the Fortress Monastery received the transmission simultaneously, every cogitator with a communication link, every astropathic relay. The evidence of the chapter's practices, their secret extraction programs, their use of failed candidates as processing material, spread outward in a cascade of data that I could not control and could not stop. The Battle Brothers restraining me realized what was happening. Their enhanced hearing could detect the burst of information flooding through the Fortress Monastery's communication systems. Their tactical awareness understood the implications. One of them killed me. The bolter round took my head off at the neck, a clean decapitation that should have ended everything. My body collapsed, my consciousness dissolved into the familiar darkness of temporary death, and for a moment I thought perhaps this time would be different. Perhaps the damage would be too severe. Perhaps my regeneration would finally fail. It did not fail. It never failed. The reconstruction of a human head from nothing but a severed neck stump took 4 hours. I was conscious for most of it, aware of my brain rebuilding itself neuron by neuron, aware of memories and identity returning in fragments that did not always fit together correctly. When the process was complete, I opened new eyes and found myself sealed in a containment cell with monitoring systems more sophisticated than anything I had encountered before. The data had spread. That much I could determine from the activity outside my cell, from the emergency Vox traffic that filtered through the walls, from the unmistakable tension of a chapter facing external scrutiny it had never anticipated. Inquisitorial ships had been dispatched. Questions were being asked. The Fortress Monastery was locked down, its population unable to leave while investigations proceeded. I had accomplished something. Not everything I wanted, but something. They came for me eventually. Not Battle Brothers this time, but inquisitorial representatives in the black armor of Ordo Hereticus, accompanied by tech priests and Medicae specialists who looked at my regenerating flesh with expressions I could not read. They asked questions. I answered them. The recordings I had made, the data I had transmitted, the evidence of the chapter's practices, all of it became part of an official record that would follow the appropriate bureaucratic channels until some distant authority decided what to do about it. I did not expect justice. The Imperium was not designed for justice, but I expected consequences, and consequences I had learned were sometimes enough. The chapter master requested to see me before the inquisitorial representatives removed me from the Fortress Monastery. I was brought to his chambers in restraints that my regeneration could have escaped at any moment, facing a warrior who had led this chapter for 3 centuries and who had inherited practices that stretched back millennia before his ascension. "You have destroyed us," he said without preamble. "I have exposed you. The distinction is meaningless. Our practices were necessary. The gene seed compatibility rate in baseline humans is catastrophic without intervention. We found a way to improve those odds, to reduce the waste of promising candidates, to serve the Emperor more effectively than chapters that simply discard their failures. You consumed people. We used resources that would otherwise have been lost. The candidates who could not transform could not. serve as battle brothers, could not be returned to civilian life, could not exist in any capacity that the Imperium would recognize. We gave them purpose. We made their failure meaningful. I looked at him, at the centuries of conviction in his eyes, and I understood that he believed what he was saying, truly believed it. The practices that had consumed Voss and would have consumed me were not cruelty in his mind. They were efficiency, pragmatism, service to an emperor who demanded everything and forgave nothing. The men in your processing vaults, I said, the ones still connected to extraction systems, what happens to them now? They will be terminated. The Inquisition has ordered it. Centuries of service, of contribution, of purpose, and they will be granted the death they always claimed to want. You have given them that at least, though I suspect they would not thank you for it. I thought of Voss, of his ancient eyes and his resignation and his warning to make sure my purpose was my own. I thought of the names on the cell walls, the candidates who had been used until there was nothing left to use, and I realized that the chapter master was probably right. They would not thank me. They had made peace with their fate, had found meaning in their suffering, had accepted consumption as a form of service, but that was their choice, made under conditions they could not escape, with options they could not access, in a system designed to make compliance the only rational response. I had given them a different ending, whether they wanted it or not. What happens to me, I asked. The Inquisition will study you. Your regenerative capabilities are unique, apparently, beyond anything their records document. They believe you may represent a new strain of gene seed mutation, something that could be replicated under controlled conditions. You will become a research subject, analyzed and tested and eventually processed for whatever compounds your flesh can provide. So, nothing changes. I move from one set of users to another. You are a resource, candidate. You have always been a resource. The only question is, who benefits from your consumption? He said it without cruelty, without anger, simply stating a fact that he considered self-evident, a truth about my nature that I was supposed to accept as easily as he did. I looked at my hands, the flesh that would not stop rebuilding, the tissue that had absorbed enough genetic material to fool security systems, enough data to destroy a chapter, enough modification to broadcast across an entire fortress monastery. You're wrong, I said. The inquisitorial representatives came for me then, before the chapter master could respond. They led me through corridors filled with battle brothers who watched my passage with expressions ranging from hatred to confusion to something that might have been the beginning of understanding. The data I had released was circulating among them now. The truth about their enhancements, their heritage, the cost of their creation. Some of them would reject it, others would not. Changes once started tended to propagate. They loaded me onto a transport ship that would carry me to inquisitorial facilities for evaluation and study and eventual consumption. The cell they placed me in was similar to all the other cells I had occupied, except that the walls were clean. No scratches, no names, no tally marks. Counting trials survived. I pressed my fingers to the metal surface and began to carve. Not counting trials this time, not documenting failures. Instead, I carved the names I remembered, the candidates whose tissue had been consumed to build a chapter's success, the men who had served without acknowledgement and died without recognition. Voss, Theron, Calder, Morrow. All the names from the cell walls, preserved in my memory because Voss had told me to remember. The Inquisitors would study me. They would test my regeneration, document my capabilities, eventually try to process me for whatever unique compounds my flesh produced. But they would find that I was not simply a body that healed. I was a body that learned, a body that adapted, a body that had been preparing for survival since the moment I realized that death would not be granted to me. They would try to use me, and I would become something they could not use. The ship entered the warp, and the walls of my cell began to whisper with voices I had never heard before. The creatures that lived in that space between spaces could smell my blood, could sense the wrongness of flesh that would not stay dead, could feel the modifications I had built into my regenerating tissue. They pressed against the ship's Geller field, testing its boundaries, searching for weaknesses. One of them found me, not physically, not yet, but through the connection that my modified cells had inadvertently created when I built them to broadcast data across Vox networks. The thing in the warp could use that connection, could speak through it, could offer alternatives that the Inquisition would never permit. I listened. I did not accept. Not yet. But I listened because the thing in the warp understood something that the Chapter Master and the Inquisitors did not. It understood that a resource that could not be consumed was not a resource at all. It was a threat. The ship emerged from the warp after 17 days, the Geller field had held, the creature's whispers had faded, and the Inquisitors had not discovered the conversation I had been conducting in the privacy of my modified mind. They led me from the transport to a facility that looked like every other Imperial installation I had ever seen: Gothic architecture, religious iconography, the machinery of human suffering disguised as necessary function. The research began: tests, samples, procedures designed to understand the mechanisms of my regeneration and eventually to replicate them for purposes I was not informed of. The Inquisitors were more professional than the chapter's apothecaries, their methods more refined, their documentation more thorough, but the fundamental relationship was the same. I was a specimen. They were researchers. Nothing I did or said or felt mattered except insofar as it provided useful data. I let them believe I had accepted this. Let them believe the resistance I had shown at the Fortress Monastery was an aberration, a response to specific conditions that no longer applied. I cooperated with their procedures, answered their questions, allowed them to cut and burn and break me without complaint. And in the silence between procedures, I continued to modify my regenerating flesh, building new capabilities, developing new connections, preparing for a moment that I could not yet define but knew was coming. The thing in the warp reached out again during a period of extended sedation. Its voice was clearer now, less distorted by the barriers that usually separated material and immaterial space. It spoke of transformations more complete than anything the gene seed could provide. It offered power that the Imperium could not grant and could not revoke. I asked it what it wanted in exchange. Service, it said. The same thing everyone wanted from me. The same currency I had been paying since the first trial that failed to kill me and failed to transform me. But the service it described was different. Not consumption, not extraction, not the slow processing of my flesh for compounds that would benefit others while I lingered in perpetual survival. Instead, it offered participation. A role in events larger than imperial bureaucracy or chapter politics or inquisitorial research programs. A purpose that I would choose rather than have chosen for me. I asked for time to consider. It laughed, if creatures in the warp could be said to laugh, and it told me that time was something I had more of than any being in the galaxy. The Inquisitors detected the communication eventually. They're psychic. Monitoring systems were sophisticated enough to register the anomalous activity in my brain patterns, the traces of warp contact that my modified cells could not completely conceal. They isolated me immediately, subjected me to purification rituals and psychic scanning and interrogation techniques designed to determine the extent of my corruption. I told them everything: the conversations, the offers, the consideration I had given to alternatives that any loyal Imperial subject should have rejected without thought. I told them because I had learned that cooperation was the best way to avoid attention, and because the information I provided was exactly what they expected to find. They did not find the modifications I had built into my regenerating flesh during months of unmonitored recovery periods. They did not find the data I had absorbed from their own cogitator systems during procedures when they believed I was unconscious. They did not find the preparations I had made for eventualities they could not anticipate. They found a contaminated specimen that required additional security measures. They found an excuse to increase their research efforts. They found what they were looking for, because looking for it meant not looking for anything else. The facility's security increased, my cell was reinforced, the procedures became more invasive, more destructive, more desperate to extract value before whatever corruption they believed I carried could spread. I let them destroy me, again and again, I let them incinerate my flesh and dissolve my organs and pulverize my bones. I let them watch my regeneration rebuild everything they had demolished. Let them document the process. Let them become confident that they understood the mechanisms they were studying. They did not understand. They saw a body that healed. They did not see a body that evolved. Each destruction taught me something. Each regeneration incorporated what I had learned. The flesh that rebuilt itself was not identical to the flesh that had been destroyed. It was better, stronger, more capable of surviving whatever the Inquisition decided to do next. And when the thing in the warp reached out again, during a procedure that had reduced me to a consciousness floating in a suspension of cellular debris, I gave it my answer. Not service, not the exchange it had offered, something else entirely. I told it that I had spent years as a resource, passed from one user to another, consumed for purposes I never chose. I told it that the chapter had tried to process me, and I destroyed them. I told it that the Inquisition was trying to study me, and I would destroy them too. And I told it that if it wanted something from me, it would have to take it the way everyone else had tried to take it. It would have to break what could not be broken. The warp thing considered my response. I felt its attention shifting, reassessing, recognizing something in my defiance that it had not expected to find. And then it withdrew, not defeated but intrigued, leaving behind a trace of connection that I could use if I chose to use it. I chose not to, not because I was loyal to an Imperium that had treated me as raw material for its endless wars, not because I feared the corruption that warp entities offered, but because I had finally understood what Voss meant when he told me to find my own purpose. I was not a resource. I was not a specimen. I was not a failed candidate, or a persistent anomaly, or a contaminated subject requiring additional security measures. I was a weapon, one that had been forged in the chapter's processing vaults and tempered in the Inquisition's research facilities, one that could not be destroyed, could not be consumed, could not be controlled by systems designed for resources that eventually depleted. The flesh that rebuilt itself after that final destruction was different, purposeful in ways that my previous regenerations had not been. The modifications I had spent months developing activated simultaneously, transforming my body into something the Inquisitor's scanners could not recognize and their containment systems could not hold. I walked out of the facility through walls that my enhanced physiology could dissolve and security systems that my integrated genetic codes could bypass. I walked past guards whose weapons could not inflict damage faster than I could heal it. I walked into an Imperial world that had never anticipated the existence of something like me. Marcus Vance. That was still my name, the only thing the Imperium had not managed to take from me, and now I had a purpose that was entirely